presentation. You know, I'm in Chapel Hill, and we just talk a little bit about intervention there. So one of the things that Mary did that I think is useful, and we're coming back to what Jennifer is talking about, is this need to understand how the evidence is linked to the mechanisms of the intervention that we believe are or should be producing the change that we're hoping to see in our outcomes. And Mary put up a very beautiful conceptual model that clearly linked where the evidence that was in the existing research literature was linked to the mechanisms of the intervention that they believe is linked to the change that they see. When we're talking about, I guess, generation 1, ESTs, some, though many, do not have these clear models. And in thinking about incorporating evidence and trying to translate evidence to different populations, to complex traumas, or I'm sorry, not traumas, complex settings, complex clients, complex comorbidities, it's this type of model that I think will allow us to begin to see what some of those mechanisms are and how they may work across populations and across problems. Though I think one of the challenges, in particular for social work, that we're going to be facing, that we're already facing actually, is that our evidence is rapidly changing. And our evidence is not just rapidly changing, but it's rapidly moving into areas that have not been areas where social workers have traditionally received the training that they need. And in particular, what I'm talking about is the focus on neuroscience, developmental neuroscience, and epigenetics, particularly for those of us that are mental health researchers. Mary speaks about working in mental health, and there's child welfare involvement. She brought up one of the things that I began looking at with my teams, and that I hope social work as a profession, particularly social work researchers and educators, will be able to pay more attention to the evidence. And that's how issues that we deal with every day, like complex trauma in young children, affect the neurodevelopment. We're beginning to learn how different environmental factors are really playing into brain development and biology. And other fields are linking the mechanisms of their intervention to the places in the brain where these changes are occurring. And as many of us have said today, social workers are the ones who are providing these interventions. I think many of us who particularly work with mental health or child development are in social work because we believe that social work researchers know more about this. We've been clinicians, and we're training the generations of clinicians that will work with these families who have great need. And yet, we almost just kind of play lip service, at least in my experience, in many of our master's programs as well as our research training programs, to the biological piece. And that's not where research is going in this area. So I think that's going to be one of the challenges that I hope folks will begin to think of addressing when we're looking at the rapidly changing and complex nature of the evidence that should be informing our interventions.
Great, okay, so at this point we're going to open it up for questions and comments from you all. And we have plenty of time, so. Was there a comment in the back?
First of all, several observations. One is that Houston has surpassed New York City being the most diverse community in the country. So as a result, here in Houston, we experience greater challenges. Also, in terms of the involvement of men, you know, the field of social work is dominated by women. And as a result, even in school, when you go ahead and hear about the involvement of men, it's always in terms of lacking involvement, not in terms as to how to empower men. Within the field of intellectual disabilities, which is really my area of specialty, I have been able to go ahead and take off my blinders and identify men who do show up, the few men who do show up, and you're able to go ahead and empower those individuals to become leaders and advocates. You have to be able to make that effort on those individuals. You cannot continue to practice the self-fulfilling prophecy of saying men are not going to be involved. If that can happen on the side of intellectual disabilities, it can also happen on the sister side of mental illness. The other thing is that the focus has been on mental health, but the stressors of many families is that sometimes they have children with a co-occurring diagnosis, that is mental illness and ID. And the schools of social work are not identifying ID. So evidence-based is lacking, of course, because no one is going into that area. It's not sexy enough. So as a result, you have limited information. So those are just some of my observations. I don't particularly have a question, but I thought I would address those issues that were mentioned.
Yeah, first, I really like you at the study. Yeah. And can you talk a little bit about the money side and then the budget? I think it may need more than step and then more budget, I think. So if your study is implemented to the county level or like the state level, how much is step and then how much money do you think either it needs more or less?
So the question is about the budget? For the study and sort of how the real world settings, how the budget impacted the research?
Okay, thank you for the interpretation.
So let me just take a step back to make sure that we don't have people in the audience saying, unless you have a couple of $1 million, you can't do this work. So this body of kind of work was built on a number of smaller, one agency, two agency tests to help build a model as you went forward. And so those were, in the early days, very low budget, no budget operations. By the time we got to the R1, that is a pretty sizable grant. The more challenging thing about being at least my sense of what's most challenging about being a kids mental health services researcher is that unlike some of the other intervention activities where you can pay families to come, that isn't in the budget. So there is some ability to compensate providers for some lost time in terms of training. There's a pretty dismal statistic about what's the kind of cost to agencies every time they release their workers for a day of training. It's in the hundreds and hundreds of dollars. And so the budget went to compensate agencies for some of that lost revenue when providers were gone. Small incentives for families to fill out some standardized measures. And so there certainly the scale of the study that I presented today couldn't have been done without sizable external funding, because given the sample size and the tracking and the longitudinal follow-up. But what's important is how that money influences what the end product is. And so one of the things that we were pretty committed to is making sure that the conditions that families journey through and providers journey through, that those mirrored as much of the real world as possible. We also had to work with our state authority, that the services had to fit within what our state paid for in terms of Medicaid dollars. And some of those were constraints on what you could and could not do in the intervention, and so we really had to pay attention. So the bulk of the funds went to agencies to defray, and I think, was it Flavio? Somebody made a really nice point around the investment that one could make with your agency partners and with your family advocates, that this becomes a way to really partner not only around kind of asking the questions and designing protocols, but also benefiting from the research resources. I'm not sure if I got the whole of your question, but I tried.
Thank you.
I have a question. I'm trying to think about how I would articulate this question. Going kind of back to what we talked about earlier in terms of the stages, and when you're talking about the exploratory stage. Oh, sorry. When you're talking about the exploratory stages, and then early in your slide, you threw down all of the different evidence, right, that we have. So can you talk about any of your processes in the exploration stage about how you go about looking at all that information and then coming to a decision about what's the best fit for your intervention? For me as a practitioner and administrator, that really becomes my real challenge.
I'll start us, but our panelists are very talented at this process as well. So I like what Jennifer said about legends. So one of the legends that exists in kind of my area is that community members, families can't look at our evidence and make decisions about it. It's too complicated. They'll never understand. It's the EVPs, we're the only ones that can read the intervention manuals. And so we engaged in a pretty collaborative process where families and providers and we as researchers, as quickly as possible, went through, there's hundreds of articles around the empirical links with kids and conduct difficulties. Very quickly tried to sort through what did the evidence base say and to really keep families in the process of being able to comment on does that fit or not with their experience. So going through that process, because we're a university, didn't take that long. If an agency does this by themselves, I don't know anybody in the agency world that can do it by yourself, but the partners in this room really have some of the capabilities of being able to search for those studies, to be able to help walk you through them, to be able to make some decisions. Why collaborative partnerships are so important in my work, because we can do some of the things that agencies can't, and you can do some of the things that we can't. And so it was an intensive, but just a few month process that we scanned that literature and really went through. And it became a way that we could also really have families respond to what the science said potentially would be helpful to their kids.